It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third session in our series of Future of Cultural Diplomacy. Please note that today's session is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone at the Future of Diplomacy Project. These wonderful folks have done so much for my initiative, and I'm also very thankful to the Belfer Center, and especially want to thank Ambassador Burns for his support of this effort. As many of you know, Ambassador Nicholas Burns is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also the founder and faculty chair of the Future of Diplomacy Project. Thank you so much, Ambassador Burns. We've been working together on this program because we believe, along with all of you here, that this is an important area of diplomatic practice. My sincere thanks also to the Kennedy School for their support of the initiative, and I'd like to thank the Advanced Leadership Institute here at Harvard, where I have the pleasure of being a fellow currently. Before moving forward with the program, I'd also like to acknowledge the remarkable global audience we have with us today, notably two of our past speakers, Nancy Zalwinski of the State Department and Professor Emeritus Joe Nye. Thank you for being with us. I will be turning to Ambassador Burns shortly, and he will introduce today's guest, UNESCO Director-General Audrey Azoulay. We will have the chance to hear from Director General, and I will be joined by Alison Hillegeist, Deputy Director of the Future of Diplomacy Project, to ask Madame Azoulay for conversation regarding cultural diplomacy. We will then open it up for questions. And before we conclude, I'll invite you to please take a moment to also fill out our survey, which I hope will better inform us as to how we can plan our programming and serve this important community. Thank you so much. And Ambassador Burns, please take it away.
Carla, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. I should say even good evening to those of you who are with us from Western Europe and parts beyond. This is going to be a very interesting and I think important conversation on multilateral cultural diplomacy with the Director-General of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay. We're delighted that she's here. I'll say a word about her in just a minute, but I wanted to thank Carla and Alison for having put this together, and Carla in particular for having been the inspiration for these series of events on cultural diplomacy. I think all of you know she's a renowned opera singer. And she has been on stage for many years, but she's also now part of our community at Harvard. She's part of the Advanced Leadership Initiative and has brought this idea of cultural diplomacy to prominence here at Harvard and on this Zoom stage that we have. So I really want to thank her in particular. Carla will be back at Harvard in the autumn semester, and we anticipate and are planning for many more events. Nancy Zalwinski is here. Nancy's the Director of Cultural Programs at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. She was the principal speaker at our first event that Carla and I hosted. Our second event was with our friend, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, and our great friend and Harvard colleague, Professor Joe Nye, the former dean of the Kennedy School. And now we round out the series this semester with a very distinguished guest in Audrey Azoulay. I think all of you know she leads the world's largest multilateral institution devoted to cultural issues. She is, of course, based in Paris, and she is French. She's been a leader in France and in Europe and now globally on cultural issues for a long time. She served in 2014 as advisor to the President of the French Republic on cultural issues and then became Minister of Culture and Communication. She's a graduate of two really excellent schools, the École Nationale d'Administration and the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. And she's now our world leader at our most important United Nations institution devoted to trying to bring people together through the power of culture. And so we're looking very much forward to her remarks today. She's going to give some remarks, and then Carla and Alison will lead a conversation with her. We'll bring as many of you into that conversation as we can. Madame Azoulay, bienvenue ici à Harvard. Nous sommes très, très heureux que vous soyez ici avec nous aujourd'hui. Thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Burns. Thank you, Carla, Alison, for inviting me. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to speak with you all today at the Harvard Kennedy School and with people participating from all over the world. Thank you for your kind words about me. So as you've said, I am a Director General of UNESCO. I've been elected in this position 3.5 years ago. And before that, I've always worked in the cultural sector in my country, in France, where I had the opportunity at a moment to be even Minister of Culture, because we have a Ministry of Culture in France. And it is something we pay a lot of attention to. And now in this institution, in UNESCO, it's a place where it's very a good opportunity for me to talk to you and to talk with you about cultural diplomacy, about this very specific diplomacy as it is practiced in UNESCO, in a place where I think it's very different from other multilateral institutions. This institution was created after the Second World War, after one of the darkest chapters in human history, with this idea that to build back better, to build peace in a sustainable way, you could not only rely on economic cooperation or diplomacy as usual, but you had to anchor this international cooperation first in values, the values of human rights, the values of human dignity, and to cooperate in things that have long-term impact, like culture, like education, because at the beginning it was especially education, culture, the sciences, and freedom of expression. So our organization, although it is part and functions like all the other UN institutions, is very special in its mandate because of its history, because of the substance on which it works. And the idea really is to promote peace by influencing the mentalities, the perceptions, the structural forces that drive societies. Our ambition is summed up in the opening lines of UNESCO's constitution that were penned by an American, the American poet and Librarian of Congress, Archibald MacLeish. Since war begins in the minds of women and men, it is in the mind of women and men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So it really still sums up our ideal and our ambition. And we try to deliver on this ambition in 3 ways: by enacting international norms and standards, rules, like conventions on the protection of heritage or on protection of the right to education; by taking operational action on the ground in a certain number of places in the world and throughout history, and maybe we can come back to that later; and also by being a places of exchanges of ideas, laboratory of ideas, to address the major challenges of our time, and in a way which is once again a bit different from other places, from other arenas, because you have countries around the table that can have very different positions on other front, but that will come here to cooperate on a positive agenda and on emerging issues that are linked to UNESCO's mandate. It's like a very specific platform that cannot be analyzed in the same way as platforms that are only focused on security or the economy. As the subject we deal touch on some of the deep-rooted and structural issues that underpin our societies. And it's also between the member states, there is not exactly the same kind of relationship or hierarchies that you can find in more classical arena of multilateralism. They are not duplicated here, and we can create sometimes a dialogue or even cooperation that would be inconceivable elsewhere, although we all have tensions and difficulties like everywhere. I'd like to maybe mention a few examples and then conclude examples on things that have been done here in UNESCO to build peace through education and scientific cooperation. For instance, in the 50s, after the war in Korea in the 50s, UNESCO has been in charge of producing and distributing school textbooks, which drove the reconstruction of South Korea and its taste for education and higher education. An example of scientific collaboration, what we have done first in Europe to develop an infrastructure of cutting-edge research center technology, the CERN, in 1954, with a cross-border scientific cooperation in fundamental physics, something we've replicated recently, and we've opened it 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago now, a particle accelerator facility for the Middle East. It's in Jordan, but where you have countries at the table that do not sit at the same table in other areas. And if we have time, I could elaborate on that. We've also launched historic campaigns to safeguard incredible sites and monuments worldwide, like in Nubia in Egypt, the complexes of Abu Simbel and other temples in Nubia, or the Khmer architecture of Angkor, where you have 19 countries working together. And it started after the civil war in Cambodia to unite the country around its heritage. Things we try to do now in Iraq. And if you have time, I can develop as well. And in UNESCO, there have also been, for me, pioneer decisions and initiatives in terms of collaboration to protect the natural heritage. It can be natural heritage sites, but also biosphere reserves around the world, where we develop both protection of natural heritage, but participation of the communities and development of sustainable activities. We also have a large part of our mandate, which is on communication and information to improve the legal and legislation, the frameworks on freedom of expression and the protection of journalists, and many other areas of cooperation that we've seen is very crucial in times of crisis, like the crisis we've just been living with the pandemic, with the COVID pandemic. We've seen the crucial importance of international cooperation, particularly in science, education, and information. And we are now having to change, having to face, the challenges of our time, not the challenges of the times of our creation, but the new challenges. For instance, in our mandate on science, the new ethical issues that are linked to technology or science. And we are now, right now, working on a recommendation, a normative instrument on open science to foster scientific cooperation and to make research more accessible and more inclusive. We are also working on a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, an issue that we all know is very important, and that has also an ethical side that must be dealt with at international level. And we are now working very much with government, especially in the Global South, in reopening schools after the COVID closures, or universities. I know you've also been living through this in your program, the school closures that have had a huge impact, and especially for girls. So maybe I won't come back on all those examples, but to let you know a little bit the wide scope of UNESCO, the fact that I think its initial ambition is still very much needed today, although we apply it on the issues of our times and the issues of tomorrow. But I look forward to going into more details on our work in response to contemporary challenges during our discussion. And I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for your indulgence, because you can hear that I'm not a native speaker, and you can hear my French accent, and sometimes maybe I will not have the right word but it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director-General Azoulay. Merci beaucoup. It's really such a pleasure to hear from you and to get this acute description of the work that you're doing right now. We'd like to ask you a few questions, and I'll invite Alison to join me here. First of all, as you mentioned the history of UNESCO, we all know it as the multilateral agency in the world that is most engaged not only in the promotion of culture, but also its utility as a tool for promoting international understanding, addressing the challenges which you mentioned, and increasing education on various issues. I'm wondering right now, and I know you've spoken to this, but if you could tell us more about the global emerging issues that you think cultural diplomacy specifically would be most helpful at addressing. How and where should cultural diplomacy resources be directed, in your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, what I think that cultural diplomacy opens the spaces for dialogue where sometimes more traditional forms of diplomacy or multilateralism cannot apply or are blocked by political or geostrategic tensions. In my experience, one of the cases where I find cultural diplomacy most powerful is when it can create these dialogues in tense relationship, or even more than tense, in post-conflict situations, where you find that the cultural diplomacy can open ways that were blocked. I'd like to mention a few examples. For instance, the two Koreas. We know that the two Koreas, we know the situation. And for instance, regarding UNESCO, up till recently, they were working completely separately for the different UNESCO, for instance, inscription on a World Heritage List or intangible heritage, or they were more competing than cooperating, although they share a lot in terms of course of culture and traditions. So one of the things we've done is that we've initiated, and it was for the first time, a joint inscription between the North and the South of one of their common cultural heritage, a tradition of wrestling. And so it was the first time that it's called Shirum, for those who may know this tradition in the audience today. And for the first time, they had in front of a UN institution a joint inscription. And from that on, we build dialogue. And it's something that touches very much the people. At least for what we have known, it was really very specific. And now we're trying to see whether UNESCO can have a specific role as well regarding the DMZ and the status of the DMZ. It's a tense situation, but sometimes we're even in more tense situation, like in post-conflict. And the cultural diplomacy here again can unite international cooperation to support a country that has been torn by war, like Iraq. In Iraq, after the occupation by ISIS, where the cultural heritage was targeted, as you know, one of our initiatives has been to launch international cooperation program to revive what we've called the spirit of Mosul, which Mosul, this city that was a city of diversity, a city of university, a city of diversity of faith as well. So we've launched this initiative. We've raised a little more than $100 million so far to support the reconstruction of some cultural heritage building, or to support the education there. We are, for instance, training teachers and educators to include the question of reconciliation and prevention of radicalization in the curricula, in the schools, in Mosul. So that's, for instance, a place, those situations post-conflicts where I think cultural diplomacy can be very powerful. And sometimes it's not in such so tragic or difficult situation, but still, for instance, I don't know if you heard about it. Last year, there was a joint inscription of the traditional dish couscous in the intangible list of intangible heritage list of UNESCO, and it was a joint inscriptions by countries that have difficult diplomatic relationships sometimes, but they could unite to share a common heritage together and to present it to the rest of the world. I'd like to mention as well, maybe when you talk about also emerging issue, I think we could use more cultural diplomacy when it comes to issues like the preservation of nature, of biodiversity, because you find as well in cultural practices, in intangible heritage, sustainable ways to live with nature, sustainable ways to fish, sustainable ways to practice agriculture. So you can also rediscover in heritage more sustainable ways and living. And maybe to conclude on this point, if you put in cultural diplomacy, you include as well scientific diplomacy, education diplomacy, and then you have in a lot of fields, scientific cooperation. Like I was telling you, in the Middle East, this new particle beam light and particle accelerators in Jordan, where you have at the same table the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the Israelis, Turkey, Cyprus, something you would not imagine in another forum, but the scientific of those countries are together at the same table for this facility that we've launched. It started 20 years ago, but we really launched it 2 years ago. Or also in the scientific field, the question I touched upon in my introductory remarks on the standards and norms for the ethical issues of development of science. This as well, there is a lot of competition in terms of science, but we may find a common ethical framework through cultural diplomacies if we see it, understand it in a larger way. Over to you.
Thank you so much. That's such a comprehensive view on all of this. And I just want to note, we have some folks asking questions in the chat, and certainly Professor Nye, I'd love to get to your question. We'll just continue with a few more questions before we open it up to the general public. But thank you so much for your eagerness. And again, thank you, Director General Azoulay, for that wonderful response. I'll turn to Alison now.
Thank you so much, Carla. This year, culture and cultural engagement are really playing center stage at the G20 in ways that it hasn't in the past. And we're eager to hear from you what you expect from that, what you hope from that, particularly around conversations regarding post-pandemic recovery with regards to education, healthcare, and all the other priority issues for UNESCO.
You mean post-pandemic or in general? I'm sorry, because I didn't get the beginning of the question.
Just the significance that cultural and cultural engagement is playing at the G20 this year is significant, and what you hope for and expect from those meetings.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a very important question. UNESCO has been pushing for culture to be on the agenda of the G20. It's something we've worked on with Italy, but more generally, we've been pushing for a higher place on the international agenda of the question related to our mandate, education, culture, the science. And it's true that the pandemic, highlight the fact that these are common global issues where common goods are at stake and where we need the commitment and engagement of the international community. The fact to try and put culture higher on the international agenda in other forums than UNESCO, it didn't start yesterday, but there was one first success, I think, in 2017, when there was for the first time a general resolution on cultural heritage and security at the Security Council. And it was a joint initiative of Italy again and France. And it was very much supported and worked with UNESCO. I remember because at that time I was representing France. My predecessor was there for UNESCO, and the Italian Minister of Culture was there as well to promote this first resolution of the Security Council that wrote and took the, and how do you say, and well, stated that the attacks on cultural heritage could be considered a war crime. That was a first, this link between security and culture at general level. Now the G20, we've been working with Italy that had put culture on the G7 agenda when it had the presidency of the G7. And now that it is a president of the G20, there is a ministerial segment on culture that will be organized, and it will be for us the moment to ask for more commitment and more cooperation to the members of the G20 on issues like heritage safeguarding, the creative economy, and very important to talk about the public support as well to the creative economy or the regulatory frameworks in a time where the pandemic has accelerated the digitization in general, and it changes as well the economic model of culture. So we are going to try to have common acknowledgement of the challenges and to work on common issues, digitization, heritage and development, and the necessity as well for them to have both more national engagement in culture and international engagement in culture.
Thank you so much. As a member of the creative sector, I thank you. And I've been following closely this development of the ministerial track of the G20. In fact, you know, much has been written about it, and I've contributed to that on some level. One of the reasons that this discussion is so important for us is that, of course, our country does not have a minister of culture, sadly. So I think one of the things that we would like to address here and beyond is how America can play a very active role in supporting the work that you're doing and also supporting our own creative workforce here. So that's a bit of an aside, but I would really like to turn my question to, we have with us Professor Emeritus Joe Nye, who was with us for the last session, of course, the coiner of the phrase soft power and a celebrated author and scholar. So Professor Nye, would you like to ask a question?
Well, thank you, Carla, and thank you, Director General, for your presentation. I admire the work that you're doing at UNESCO, but I've often been puzzled about the difficulties of directing an organization with such a vast mandate over so many, many areas. So I wanted to sort of test your sense of priorities by giving you a thought experiment. Imagine that an anonymous source gave to UNESCO a significant sum of money to be used at the discretion of the Director General. What would you spend it on? What would your priorities be?
Thank you very much, Professor. First, it's an honor to try and answer one of your questions, and thank you very much for taking the time to be in this conversation. It's indeed a very good question, because it's true that UNESCO's mandate is very broad, but maybe it takes, I hope it doesn't take a crisis as important as the Second World War to understand the links between the different areas of the mandate. But the more I'm here, as I told you, I come from the cultural sector, but the more I'm here and the more I understand the links between education, science, culture, and how they interact for the project that we are implementing, or the messages we want to promote. But you're talking also about what would be the priorities if I had more funds, more money. The first thing I'd like to say is that I don't think UNESCO is that much about money. because we are not like an NGO or some other institution that provides services instead of the member states or directly operates. For me, the question is not really the money. What we would need, very importantly, and I come back to Carla's remarks, is the involvement of everyone, the political involvement of everyone. And that's why we miss the United States and Israel that have left the institution just, I think, a few weeks before my election. And we miss them because we need the universality of member states. And we are here to be, as standard setters, guide in, for instance, why does girls' education matter? Why we need more women in science? How we can have laws that better protect freedom of expression or freedom of media freedom? Why it is important to teach the history of Africa or the history of the Holocaust, but we are not doing this ourselves. So it's more like an expert network. We provide guidance, and when we have special operations on the ground, like in the history of UNESCO, the saving of the monuments in Nubia, or today Mosul, or another initiative I didn't mention that we launched for Beirut after the blast in August, then we mobilize funds and we ask international cooperation, we ask the member states to support, and more the private sector as well, which is good. So it's not that much, but of course I would be very happy to have more money and I could have more experts, and I could be maybe go more in depth in some issues, but it's not for me the priority. The priority would be to be able to be effective in those emerging issues, the issues of tomorrow, and to create international consensus on some issues.
Very good answer.
Thanks.
A wonderful question, Professor Nye. Thank you for that. And indeed, I'm so thankful for those remarks, Madame Azoulay. This is a topic that has been much talked about, and in particular, as you highlighted, the fact that United States and Israel are not members at the moment of UNESCO, but how important it is for this message of universality to be adopted by everyone. So along those lines, another question. We know, and you mentioned earlier, about the founding of UNESCO in 1945, in part to address and counter Nazi propaganda. To try to stop this violent conflict, UNESCO aimed to create means of cultural understanding to change how groups of people perceive each other. Are these seemingly intractable conflicts are there seemingly intractable conflicts today where you think multilateral agencies such as UNESCO and cultural diplomacy specifically could be particularly useful, either instead of or in addition to traditional bilateral diplomacy? In other words, I know you come from the cultural sector and you see the benefits. It's lovely to hear that support and everything you're saying. And I'm just curious how you think that we could play a more active role in tandem with the diplomatic efforts that are taking place today.
Thank you very much. What is very important, and it's also a link between the different areas of UNESCO's mandate, is that our mandate is related to the perception of others, related to identities, your own identity. Do you know where you come from, your history, the cultural heritage? Can you be proud of that in the conversation you have every day? And it's also to create cooperation around that. And for me, the cultural, the education or the cultural sectors are very powerful ways to create links. First, that go directly to the heart of the people. I mean, in the countries, it links civil societies. The role of the artist is also very important in a way to prevent conflicts, because culture is all about freedom, is all about differences, is all about not knowing borders. So building on that, you can find as well diplomatic channels that you don't have in the normal way. Another way in which our mandate is related to prevention of conflict is, of course, education. Not education in general, but education, which is also an education based on human dignity, an education that teaches the respect of the others, for the others, the respect for the difference. And that's, we do it generally, but we do it on very specific issues. For instance, when we teach the history of Holocaust, and we don't teach directly, we support the education ministers around the world to develop curricula about that, or what we call violent past in other countries as well. When we work on guides for educators to deal with issue, it's also a way to prevent conflicts. We also use the power of something very dear to universities, the social sciences in general. That's, for instance, there was this initiative launched nearly 40 years ago now in UNESCO for a general history of Africa. We call it General History of Africa. It was the idea that we need a scientific initiative for researchers from Africa to give their vision of the history of Africa. And it's something that today is more and more needed, relevant, used in the education curricula in Africa, but also in the rest of the world. Or when we work on the history of slavery, we have a project called Slave Route. It's both social science, history, but also cultural heritage because of the sites linked to the history of slavery. This also has things to teach about the issues of today, the issue of discrimination, the issue of racism, and it's very much linked to contemporary challenges. And more generally, I think the idea of a better preservation and knowing about cultural heritage, it makes you proud and makes you more open to others. And I've seen it every time, be it tangible heritage or intangible heritage. I think it's something that is crucial to the possibility of dialogue. I don't know if I've answered your question, but.
Thank you so much. You've done an amazing job answering the question. And along the lines of education and what you've discussed here, I know Alison has prepared a question regarding that as well.
Thanks, Carla. As your name suggests, UNESCO is at the core of your mission, and nearly a third of your budget is dedicated to those efforts. And I know that specifically UNESCO has created a program to deal with the effects that the pandemic has had on education. And if you could talk about that, and specifically, I think we're interested to hear how UNESCO is targeting women and girls in their education efforts. I think we all know why that's important, but the specifics on how that's being targeted, I think, are particularly interesting.
Thank you very much. And you're right. I mean, I don't know how it is the perception of UNESCO in the United States, but for instance, in France, UNESCO is very known for culture. Less for education, because it was less present in developed countries for education, but actually it's the core of the mandate. And it is why it was created. Culture came after. It was during the war in 1942, during the conflict, there was a conference in London of the ministers of education of the Allied forces, Allied states, to discuss the after conflict, what would be needed for a better world after the conflict. And it's very interesting because the Nazis were very educated. It was not a lack of education, but the question is, what were the values? What were the values underpinning their education, their programs, their curricula? And so this idea, the idea of UNESCO was to always link education to human dignity, to human rights. And so this has been at the heart of our organization. And recently, 15 months ago, we've been in an unprecedented situation for education, where we had 90% of the student population of the world out of school, or out of a university, out of school, which was a severe interruption of the right to education. So we've reorganized our activities in education as fast as we could to support, and especially for the Global South, to support distance education, remote education, by forming a coalition of course, education actors, but also private sectors, tech companies, because we needed them to support, for instance, free access to internet for educational resources in some countries or things like that. So we've created this coalition in March 2020. We have around 180 partners. And by the way, among, I think around 20 are in the United States, and that operates in more than 110 countries, and still today, to support either education through online education, but as you know, it doesn't work for half of the world, and even within developed countries, it's also very unequally distributed. So not only online education, but also through TV, through radio, all forms of to support a link for the continuity of education. And in this coalition, we've had a special focus on girls' education, because it is, and it was before the pandemic, it's something we have as one of our priorities, because it's one of the areas in education where the world is still very much behind its objectives, in some parts of the world at least, in terms of access to education, duration of the education, or also choices of orientation. And we know that, and we could feel it coming, and unfortunately we saw it happening, the fact that girls were those the most at risk of dropping out of school. So we've worked on dedicated campaigns for girls back to school, and for also for government to put special attention on the return of girls back to school. But unfortunately, we've lost some girls to the pandemic because of early pregnancies, because of economic difficulties, and we know that we're going to, because of the pandemic, to fall even further behind in our objectives in terms of gender equality in education. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted that you've raised the issue of gender equality. I think that we've been seeing several questions in the chat here about that issue and about other issues. And folks, this is wonderful to see your questions. We were going to sort of take questions from our public here in a few minutes. So if you can just sort of hold those thoughts and start to raise your hands. I know we've got some issues related to China and Taiwan, and other questions here that will be interesting to get to. So perhaps just one more question, Madame Azoulay, and thank you again. You've indulged us with your perfect English, and I can only imagine how difficult this must be to do in a second language. One of our primary goals with this initiative, the Future of Cultural Diplomacy, is to fill a void in foreign policy discourse, including at higher education institutions such as Harvard. I admit I'm asking our witnesses here a leading question, but in your observation, is cultural diplomacy becoming more mainstream in foreign policy classes and discussions, or does it remain a peripheral topic? I'm wondering, regarding issues like national security, defense, intelligence, it often seems, at least in my experience in America, that culture is put at the children's table, and certainly the budget reflects that. What critical part of the conversation are we missing when we don't give cultural diplomacy a seat at the table? And would you have any advice, particularly related to this, and going back to our question about the G20 and our lack of leadership here in America, would you have any advice for how we can address this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the question you're asking about where is cultural diplomacy given enough importance in the diplomatic arena? I mean, recently, it's a bit the story of my life, trying to get a seat at the adult tables, because actually it's really, it's very underestimated. I think cultural diplomacy is extremely powerful. It's very powerful between civil societies, but it's often underestimated by governments, not all of them. Some have very well understood, both at national level and international level, that it's a very important ways to interact. But very often, when cultural diplomacy is not, or cultural issues, education, science are not taken into account, then I think it's a handicap, because you miss one of the long-term structural, powerful way to defend a model of society, values, and in international multilateral institutions like UNESCO, you have two things. You have not only the substance, the fact that you have the international community discussing and acting, collaborating together on this issue, but as it's been created in the context that I mentioned, it is very much rooted in human rights, in a humanistic approach. And this is not a given everywhere. So I think it's very important that member states invest in this institution, and that's why I would like to have as many member states, UN member states, at the table here. And I think as well, even not in multilateral arena, but in bilateral cooperation. I mean, I'm sure Ambassador Burns know the power of cultural exchanges, cultural programs in a function of an ambassador, because when you have this relationship with the artists, when you bring your artists, you create links that first will survive political cycles. When you give grants to students, this will influence them probably all their life. So we need everyone at the institution like UNESCO, need everyone at the table. And I think those that are not part of this table miss a lot of possibility. And it's not an opportunity which is missed by everyone. So it's also another political issue. I think this pandemic now has shown maybe more than ever the importance of our mandate and the fact that those common goods are global issues. So it's a very good moment to reinvest in this. And I hope the G20 will be also an opportunity for that.
Thank you very much. We now will turn to our questions. And I found one particularly intriguing by Professor Davis, who put a question in the chat. And Professor, if you would please pose your question.
Thank you so much, Director General, for your remarks. And this work is so important for all of the reasons you've given to include as many in the world as possible. And your expression of the universal scope of UNESCO's mandate turns to the point of how universal, because UNESCO includes states that are not recognized by the United Nations, such as Palestine, which of course is why the United States has left. What is your view about how universal UNESCO should be? There are non-members, the United States now, or Taiwan, or other unrecognized entities. And how can UNESCO be universal and include ways to bridge differences over what is a state?
Thank you. It's back to politics and geopolitics. Thank you for that. But it's a good question. The legal pathways and frameworks are independent in the UN in New York and in UNESCO in Paris, which means that at some point, and it was not, if I may correct you on that, it was not the reason why the United States left, because Palestine has been a member since 2011 now, and the United States have left in 2017. But of course, it was linked, but I mean, it was not precisely that. But Palestine has been admitted by a decision of the member states, sovereign decisions of the member states. At the time, there was a vote where there was 107 countries in favor, among which many allies of the United States, for instance. They took this decision. I mean, I don't want to come back on that, but it's two different set of rules in the UN and in UNESCO. Is it good? Is it bad? Could it be better? I mean, it probably could be, there could be more coherence in the international UN framework in terms of membership, because, but it's a sovereign rights of the countries to join, not to join this organization, to withdraw from an organization, but not of another, as we've seen as well. But for me, now it's a fact, it's behind us, this inclusion of member states not recognized by the UN. They're part of UNESCO, and the idea now is to work starting from that, but still, I mean, you can try and fix things. There are certainly a lot of things to be fixed. You can try to do better, but you cannot, if you leave the table, you make it worse. At least it's my opinion. And we still work very much with civil society today in the US, for instance, scientific community, education community, the links are very strong. The creative cities, the World Heritage Sites. So all this still exists, but what has disappeared is the participation in the governing bodies. So it's like you give up your rights to have a vote, an opinion in the most strategic issues, but you're still part of the system. And also maybe another important point I'd like to mention, this issue of the Palestinian, the Israelis, the Middle East, Jerusalem has always been a very difficult issue, I mean, everywhere, not only in UNESCO, but as we deal with cultural heritage, it's always more sensitive because once again, you touch on identity. The words are important. How do you call some places by what name, etc. So in UNESCO, until recently, all the resolutions on the Middle East were adopted by vote, and vote that were separating and dividing our governing bodies, be it the World Heritage Committee or the Executive Board of UNESCO. But I'm glad to say that over the last 3 years now, since my arrival, we've negotiated and found ways to have a consensus on all the resolutions that concerned the Middle East. So now they're adopted by consensus, and they are no longer a divisive political issue in UNESCO. And I hope at some point UNESCO can not only be no longer be a place where it's no longer a division, but can also contribute to solutions, because probably through education as well, through cultural cooperation, through scientific cooperation, we could try to bring a positive agenda in this very, very sensitive question. Thank you.
Director General, thank you. That you've certainly already done that. From one outsider's perspective, one fan's perspective, UNESCO has certainly already contributed quite a bit. We have time for one more question. I want to say a quick thank you for everyone who is posing questions here in the chat. We do have a hard stop today at 1 o'clock. We invite you to take our survey, to follow up. I've put my personal email in the chat. We're eager to keep these dialogues and discussions going, and are so grateful for this conversation. Madame Directeur-General, we'd like to turn for the last question to a colleague of mine, Haifa. Haifa, would you like to pose your question, please?
Thank you, Carla. Madame Directeur-General, it's always a pleasure and a privilege to hear you speak. And my question is more about looking to the future and what UNESCO plans to do in the area of AI, artificial intelligence, where you're working and the world is clamoring more and more for racial justice, for gender equality. All these questions are also going to appear in our technology. And artificial intelligence is going to show the bias that is integrated into the thinking of men and, white men mainly, who will impose a certain attitude, not even by choice, but it will come naturally. And I know that you're working very hard at UNESCO on making sure that the bias is reduced, if not removed. Could you expand a little on the work you're doing in the area of artificial intelligence? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a question which is very much a question of today and tomorrow. Today, because we are right now trying to negotiate, the member states are negotiating a text, a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence that addresses those issues. And we worked with experts from around the world, including the United States, but from around the world, to deal with those issues and to set a series of principles to address the social biases, the gender biases, the question of transparency, the question of responsibility, the question of privacy. So all this issue, we proposed a draft, and now the member states are negotiating. But interestingly, the negotiation is very difficult. There again, you find geopolitics and the different visions. And this is one of the toughest negotiations we have now at the moment. I mean, it's a normal negotiation, of course, it has to take place, but we have high ambition for our member states to adopt in November this recommendation, which would be non-binding, but which would set a standard. But we have to go even further than that, because you mentioned it, there's the question also of who is now building the algorithm, which data, which engineer, and we've released a study that I would be happy to share, that a year and a half ago, called "I'd Blush If I Could," on the question of gender and the question of and it showed that women were a very small minority in artificial intelligence and digital jobs. And we link that also back to education, and we come back to stereotypes, perception, access to scientific career. So it's a long process, but we need the world to be aware of that, because it's going to be the grammar of our world tomorrow. So it's a structural, important issue, and I think it's really linked to the ethics of science, so linked to our mandate, and we have here a universal fora to work on that. So thank you very much. Merci.
Madame Directeur Générale, merci beaucoup de nous avoir donné ces grands conseils et votre temps. Thank you so much for being with us and taking the time. We've kept you 1 minute over, so we will close the session with deepest gratitude. Thank you to the Future of Diplomacy, the Belfer Center, Harvard. Thank you all for being with us. And most importantly, please join me in thanking Madame Directeur Générale Azoulay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was mute. Thank you, merci. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.